Here on our channel, people's stories come to life. Stories from different eras, professions, and destinies. Each of them follows their own path, their own life woven from circumstances, challenges, and choices. Before we step into their world, make sure to subscribe, and later, share your impressions in the comments. Now, let's begin. Some stories don't start with loud events. They start small, with details, with moments that seem insignificant, yet hold entire worlds within them. These are stories about people who never chose to be heroes. They simply lived, worked, made mistakes, learned from them, and kept moving forward. The lives of such people unfold like a slowly blooming flower, each petal revealing itself in its own time, each layer hiding new secrets, new pains, new joys. This is a story from a time when the world was just a little different. The city smelled of iron and coal dust, and that smell became the first language a child learned in the narrow streets, climbing up from the river. Before words, before understanding, there was the taste of soot on the tongue and the orange glow against the night sky, where the mills breathed fire without ceasing. The air itself had weight and color, a yellow-gray haze that settled on windowsills and in the creases of a washwoman's hands. And no amount of scrubbing ever made anything truly clean again. He was born in a tenement on Polish Hill, in rooms that faced the alley where chickens picked through garbage, and where the pump froze solid 4 months of the year. The building leaned slightly to the left, as though tired of standing upright. His father worked the day shift at Jones and Laughlin, came home with burns on his forearms and stories he tried to make funny so his wife would not worry. His mother took in washing from the families on the better streets, where houses had porches and trees grew in deliberate rows. The boy understood early that the world was divided into those who worked with their backs and those who did not, and that his family belonged firmly to the first category. He learned to carry water without spilling, to keep quiet when his father slept in the afternoon before the night shift, to make a game of counting the shirts his mother scrubbed in her big tin tub. She sang sometimes, old songs from a place he had never seen, and the words meant nothing to him, but the melodies meant home. At night, the mills roared like living things, and their light painted the ceiling above his straw mattress in shades of amber and rust. He fell asleep to that glow, and to the sound of his parents speaking in low voices at the table, adding and subtracting numbers that never quite balanced. His father's laugh was quick and surprised him, even when nothing seemed funny. And his mother's hands never stopped moving, mending or folding or kneading, as though stillness itself was a luxury they could not afford. When he was 7, his father brought home a newspaper someone had left behind at the mill. The boy stared at the columns of tiny marks, fascinated by the idea that these shapes held meaning, that they could carry a voice across distance and time. His father could not read them, but a neighbor who had been to school for 3 years in the old country translated a few sentences about a bridge being built somewhere, and the boy felt something shift inside him, a hunger that had no name yet. The streets were his schoolroom, and the lessons came from observation. He learned which shopkeepers would give a hungry child the heels of yesterday's bread, and which ones kept a stick behind the counter. He learned that policemen did not patrol the tenement blocks with the same attention they gave to the avenues where gaslights burned brighter. He learned to read faces before he could read words, to know when his father came home whether the shift had been dangerous or merely exhausting? To understand from his mother's shoulders when the rent was due and they were short. One winter morning when he was 10, his father did not come home at all. There was an accident at the mill, a ladle of molten iron that tipped and splashed, and 3 men died quickly, while a 4th lingered for 2 days before his burns took him. The boy's father was among the first 3, and the family received no compensation because the company said he had been careless, though no one who knew him believed that for a moment. The boy did not cry at first. He stood very still while his mother wept, and he felt something harden in his chest, something that would never quite soften again. After that, everything changed, and nothing changed. They still lived in the same rooms, but now his mother took in even more washing, and her hands cracked and bled in the cold. The boy stopped being a child with time to play in the streets. He woke before dawn and went down to the corner where the newsboys gathered, and he bought papers on credit to sell to workers heading to the mills. His voice grew hoarse from shouting headlines about events in distant places that meant nothing to him, but the pennies added up, and he brought them home to his mother each night. He discovered that selling papers required more than a loud voice. It required knowing which corners had the most foot traffic, which headlines would catch attention, which customers could be charmed into buying an extra edition. He learned to banter and joke, to make himself memorable so men would seek him out, to keep his money hidden in his shoe because the older boys would rob the younger ones if given a chance. The work was cold and competitive and sometimes frightening, but it was work, and work was survival. The papers themselves became something more than merchandise. In the slow hours, he began to puzzle out the letters, matching them to sounds he knew, asking questions of anyone who would answer. A woman who ran a corner store taught him the alphabet in exchange for running errands. An old man who had been a teacher in Germany corrected his pronunciation and showed him how vowels could change everything. Reading came to him in pieces, like a door opening inch by inch, and behind that door was a world larger than Pittsburgh, larger than Pennsylvania, stranger and more various than he had imagined possible. By the time he was 12, he could read well enough to understand what he was selling, and he began to notice things. He noticed that when workers died at the mills, the stories were always short and always blamed the workers. He noticed that when rich men built new mansions in Shadyside, the articles were long and admiring. He noticed that some news was given big headlines, and some was buried on back pages or not printed at all. And he began to understand that someone was making choices about what people should know. His mother worried about him constantly, hovering between pride and fear. She wanted him to find steady work, to become an apprentice to a trade that would keep him fed and safe. She was terrified that he would end up in the mills like his father. But she was equally terrified that his ambitions would lead him somewhere dangerous, somewhere beyond her protection. She made him promise to stay away from the furnaces, from the union organizers who sometimes spoke on street corners, from anything that might draw the wrong kind of attention. He promised, and he meant it. But he also could not help noticing things. He noticed the men who limped from old injuries, the boys his own age who had lost fingers to machinery, the families evicted when the wage earner was hurt and could no longer work. He noticed, and he remembered, and he kept selling papers and learning to read, because reading felt like a kind of freedom, even if he did not yet know what to do with it. When he was 14, a man named Kowalski, who ran a small print shop, offered him a job. Kowalski had known his father slightly, and he needed someone young and quick to fetch and carry, to learn the basics of the trade. The pay was less than the boy made selling papers, but it was indoors, and it was a trade, and his mother wept with relief when he accepted. She saw it as safety, as a step away from the streets and the mills. He saw it as something else, a chance to be near the machinery that turned words into objects, that transformed thought into ink and paper. The print shop was cramped and smelled of chemicals and hot metal and paper dust, and he loved it immediately. He swept floors and mixed inks, and learned the names of fonts and the feel of lead type under his fingers. He learned to set letters backwards so they would print forwards, to maintain the press so it would not jam, to gauge the pressure that would produce clean impressions without tearing the paper. Kowalski was patient and exacting, a man who took pride in good work and had no patience for carelessness. More than the technical skills, he learned the rhythm of deadlines, the organized chaos of getting a job done when it had to be finished, the satisfaction of seeing clean sheets come off the press in orderly stacks. He learned that print shops were places where information flowed, where people brought notices and advertisements and broadsides, where printers sometimes knew news before the newspapers printed it. He began to understand that words had power, that someone had to choose them and arrange them and decide how they would appear, and that these choices mattered. He made a friend during those years, an apprentice a few years older named Tomek, who worked at a larger print shop across town. Tomek had ambitions to become a real newspaperman, to write rather than just set type, and he talked about it with the kind of certainty that made it seem possible. They would meet on Sundays and walk through the city, and Tomek would point out buildings and tell stories about the people inside them, about scandals and business dealings and political arrangements, as though the visible city was only the surface of something much deeper and more complicated. Those walks opened his eyes to Pittsburgh as a place where things happened for reasons, where power moved in patterns, where the beautiful new library and the soot-stained tenements were connected by invisible threads of money and influence. He began to see the city not as a random collection of buildings and people, but as a system, and he began to wonder who benefited from that system and who paid for it. He did not have words for these thoughts yet, and he certainly did not speak them aloud, but they were there, forming slowly, waiting. By the time he was 16, he had grown tall and thin, with ink-stained fingers and a careful way of watching people before he spoke. He had his mother's dark eyes and his father's quick smile, though he smiled less easily than his father had. He dressed neatly in second-hand clothes his mother kept clean and mended, and he walked with his shoulders slightly hunched, as though trying not to take up too much space. He had learned to be useful and unobtrusive, to do good work without drawing attention, to listen more than he spoke. His mother was older now, her hair going gray, her hands permanently bent from years of washing. She still worried about him constantly, but she worried less than she had when he sold papers in the street. The print shop felt safe to her, a place with walls and a roof, a trade that might lead somewhere. She dreamed of him becoming a master printer someday, perhaps even opening his own shop. He did not tell her that he dreamed of something different, something he could not quite name yet, something that had to do with those newspapers he had once sold, and the stories they told and did not tell. At night, in the rooms that still smelled of lye soap and cabbage, he would read by candlelight whatever he could find. Old newspapers, borrowed books, almanacs, anything with words. He read about places he would never see, and events that seemed impossibly distant from Polish Hill. He read slowly and carefully, sounding out unfamiliar words, building a vocabulary one piece at a time. His mother would watch him sometimes with an expression that mixed pride and something like grief, as though she knew he was growing beyond her ability to protect him, moving toward a future she could not quite imagine. The city continued to grow around him, pushing outward and upward, building bridges and rail lines and factories, drawing people from everywhere to feed its furnaces and work its machines. The mills ran day and night, and the sky stayed orange even at midnight, and the Monongahela carried away the waste and brought in the coal and limestone and iron ore that kept everything running. It was a city that made things, and it made them in quantities that staggered the imagination, and it did not particularly care what happened to the people who did the making. He was 17 when Kowalski promoted him to journeyman printer with a small raise in pay and new responsibilities. He felt the weight of that promotion, the sense that he was establishing himself in the world, that he had a place and a purpose. But he also felt restless, as though the print shop, for all its satisfactions, was not quite enough. He could not have explained what he wanted instead. He only knew that when he set type for advertisements or wedding invitations, he sometimes imagined setting type for something more important, something that might change how people understood the world around them. The neighborhood was familiar now in every detail, every worn step and cracked sidewalk, every face he passed on the street. He knew the widow in the apartment below who had lost 3 children to scarlet fever. He knew the Irishman 2 buildings over who drank his wages and beat his wife on Saturday nights. He knew the Italian family who kept a garden in tin cans on their fire escape and shared tomatoes with his mother in late summer. These were his people, the ones who worked and struggled and endured, and he was one of them. And he carried their stories without knowing yet what he would do with them. The print shop became his second home, and in some ways his first. He knew its rhythms better than he knew the psalms some people recited, knew the smell of each different ink, the temperament of the press when it needed adjustment, the exact moment when Kowalski would grunt with satisfaction at a finished job. The work was honest, and it was skilled. And there was dignity in setting clean type and pulling good impressions, in seeing words arranged properly on a page. He turned 18 in a spring when strikes rippled through the mills like fever. Men walked out, demanding 10-hour days instead of 12, demanding safety equipment, demanding wages that might feed a family without the wife and children working too. The strikes failed, as they usually did. The mill owners brought in replacement workers and Pinkerton guards, and after a few hungry weeks, the men went back on the company's terms. The print shop did brisk business printing handbills for both sides, and he set type for management notices and union appeals with equal care, keeping his thoughts to himself. His mother's health had begun to fade in small ways she tried to hide. She moved more slowly, complained of pains in her joints that she blamed on the weather. He wanted to tell her to stop taking in washing, but they needed the money. And besides, she would not have listened. Work was what she knew, what gave her purpose. Without it, she would have been lost. So he said nothing and brought home his wages and tried not to notice how her hands shook when she thought he was not watching. The boarding house where he rented a room was run by a German widow named Hessler, who kept a clean establishment and tolerated no drinking or gambling. The other boarders were clerks and shopkeepers, young men trying to establish themselves, and they ate dinner together at a long table where conversation stayed carefully neutral. No one discussed politics or religion or labor troubles. They talked about baseball and the weather, and which streets had been paved, and whether the new electric streetcars would replace the horse-drawn ones. He lived quietly, and saved money, and kept his observations to himself. But he watched everything. He watched how the clerks deferred to their employers, how they dressed slightly better than they could afford, how they were careful never to be seen with the wrong people or in the wrong neighborhoods. He watched how quickly they distanced themselves from anything that smelled of trouble, how they had learned to make themselves useful without becoming threatening. He understood that this was survival, that these men had climbed one small step above the mills and the factories and were terrified of falling back down. On Sundays, he still walked with Tomek, who had gotten work at the Pittsburgh Gazette as a copyboy. Tomek talked endlessly about the newspaper business, about reporters who could write a story in an hour, about editors who killed articles for mysterious reasons, about the way news was gathered and shaped and decided upon. The Gazette building itself was magnificent, with electric lights and telegraph machines and pneumatic tubes that carried messages between floors. Tomek described it like someone describing a cathedral, and his ambition burned so bright it was almost uncomfortable to witness. Through Tomek, he began to understand how newspapers actually worked. A reporter did not simply write what happened. A reporter decided what was interesting, what angle to take, which voices to quote and which to ignore. An editor decided what fit and what did not, what would anger advertisers or powerful people, what would sell copies. The news was not discovered so much as constructed, built from choices and judgments and limitations. And recognizing this was like seeing the scaffolding behind a building that had always seemed solid and complete. He started writing in the evenings, just small pieces at first, descriptions of things he saw. A woman selling flowers at the market, a building being demolished on Fifth Avenue, the way light fell through the print shop windows at different times of day. He had no training, and his early efforts embarrassed him when he reread them, but he kept at it, trying to find words that matched what he actually saw and felt, rather than what he thought writing was supposed to sound like. He showed nothing to anyone, kept his pages hidden in his room, and told himself he was simply practicing a skill that might prove useful someday. That summer, he met a girl named Agnes, who worked as a seamstress in a shop that made clothes for the carriage trade. She had quick fingers and tired eyes, and a laugh that surprised people with its sudden loudness. They met at a church social his mother had insisted he attend, and they began walking together on Sunday evenings when she was not working. She told him about the women who came to the shop, about their elaborate dresses and casual complaints, about how much money they spent on a single garment that would be worn twice and discarded. Agnes understood that the world was unfair, but she accepted it as one accepted weather, as a condition that could not be changed. Her ambition was simple and clear: to marry someone with steady work, to have a small house with a yard, to raise children who would have better chances than she had. She looked at him and saw a young man with a trade, someone reliable, someone who might provide that future. He looked at her and saw kindness and practicality, and a kind of beauty that had nothing to do with the women in the elaborate dresses. For a while, he let himself imagine that future with her. It would be a good life. A decent life. He would become a master printer, perhaps take over Kowalski's shop when the old man retired. They would live modestly but comfortably, and their children would go to school, would learn to read before they learned to work. It was everything his mother wanted for him, everything that made sense. But something in him resisted some stubborn restlessness that had no reasonable justification. Agnes saw it in him before he acknowledged it himself. One evening, as they walked along the river, she said, "You are not really here with me. You are somewhere else, in your head, thinking about things I do not understand." He tried to deny it, but she shook her head. "I'm not angry, but I need to marry someone who wants the life I want." You want something different, even if you do not know what it is yet. A few months later, she married a mill foreman, a solid man, 10 years older, who owned a small house in Lawrenceville. She invited him to the wedding, and he went, and he was genuinely happy for her, and genuinely sad for himself. He understood that she had been right, that he would have made her unhappy eventually. But understanding did not make the loneliness any easier. He stopped going to church socials after that, stopped pretending he was looking for what other young men his age seemed to want so easily. Work became his focus and his refuge. Kowalski trusted him with more complicated jobs, with setting up advertisements that required precision and artistic judgment, with training newer apprentices. The rhythm of the work was meditative, the arranging of letters and spaces and lines, the transformation of messy handwritten copy into clean, printed text. He took satisfaction in doing it well, in meeting deadlines, in solving the small technical problems that arose with every job. The shop was busy enough that there was always something to do, never time to dwell on what was missing. But he could not stop noticing things. The city was changing rapidly, pushing upward with steel-framed buildings that seemed impossibly tall, installing electric streetlights that turned night into artificial day, paving streets and laying sewer lines and telegraph cables. Fortunes were being made with a speed and scale that seemed almost magical. Carnegie's steel empire was growing massive and sophisticated. Frick's coke ovens multiplied across the river valleys. New banks opened with marble facades. New mansions rose in the fashionable neighborhoods. And the newspapers wrote about it all in tones of celebration and inevitability. Meanwhile, the tenements grew more crowded, the mills more dangerous, the air harder to breathe. His mother's friends disappeared one by one, to injury or illness or simply exhaustion. The young men from the neighborhood either found their way into steady trades, like he had, or they disappeared into the mills and foundries, and emerged years later bent and scarred and old before their time. The distance between the worlds was growing, and the newspapers barely mentioned it, except when there were strikes or accidents. And even then, the coverage was brief and unsympathetic. He began submitting small pieces to the newspapers under a pseudonym, local interest stories about neighborhood events, profiles of shopkeepers and craftsmen, descriptions of how various trades worked. Most were rejected without comment, but occasionally one was accepted and printed, and he would see his words in the newspaper and feel a strange mix of pride and fear. He told no one about this, not Kowalski, not his mother, not even Tomek. It felt important to keep it separate, to protect this emerging part of himself from judgment or discouragement. The pseudonym he chose was deliberately unremarkable, a combination of common names that would attract no attention. When his pieces appeared, they were buried in the back pages among the classified advertisements and market reports. But they appeared, and that meant someone had read them and thought them worth printing. And that was enough to keep him writing, to keep observing, to keep trying to capture in words the texture of life in the city's working neighborhoods. His landlady's son was a rail yard worker who had gotten involved with a labor organization, attending meetings and distributing pamphlets. One night the Pinkertons came and took him away, and when he returned 2 days later he was bruised and silent, and would speak to no one about what had happened. A week after that he was fired from the rail yard and could find no other work, not anywhere. Word had been passed that he was a troublemaker. He eventually left Pittsburgh entirely, heading west where no one knew his history. The lesson was clear and brutal. There were things you did not say, people you did not associate with, ideas you did not express, if you wanted to keep working, keep eating, keep a roof over your head. The city ran on invisible rules and silent agreements, and breaking them carried consequences that could destroy a life. He absorbed this knowledge along with everyone else, learned to keep his head down, learned that survival required a certain amount of strategic blindness. But he also learned that some people chose to speak anyway, despite the costs. There were ministers who preached social gospel from their pulpits. There were labor organizers who kept organizing even after being beaten and blacklisted. There were settlement house workers who lived in the slums and tried to document conditions and lobby for reforms. These people risked everything for the chance that something might change, that the invisible rules might be challenged, that the system might bend even slightly toward justice. He admired them and feared for them, and could not decide whether they were brave or foolish, or perhaps both at once. By the time he was 24, he had become someone people relied on, but rarely noticed. He was competent and steady and careful, the kind of person who got things done without drama. Kowalski had made him the de facto foreman of the shop, responsible for managing the workflow and training the younger workers. It was a position of small authority, enough to feel the weight of responsibility, not enough to change anything fundamental about his circumstances. His mother was proud of him, in a complicated way that mixed satisfaction with a lingering sadness she never quite explained. He visited her twice a week, brought her groceries and small amounts of money, and tried not to see how much effort it took her to move around the apartment now. She had stopped taking in washing finally, and he and a few neighbors quietly helped with her rent. She spent her days sitting by the window, watching the street below, and sometimes when he visited, she would talk about his father as though he had died yesterday rather than 14 years ago. Then Tomek brought news that changed things. The Gazette needed another reporter, someone to cover local stories, someone who could write clean copy on deadline. It was not a prestigious position, but it was a reporter's job, a chance to move from setting type to shaping stories. Tomek thought he should apply, thought his pseudonymous pieces demonstrated enough skill to warrant consideration. The city editor was willing to interview anyone Tomek recommended. And Tomek's recommendation carried weight now because he had proven himself reliable and useful. He spent 3 days deciding, weighing the security of the print shop against the possibility of something more. Kowalski would be hurt if he left, would see it as abandonment after years of training and trust. His mother would worry endlessly about the instability of newspaper work. But something in him knew that if he did not try, if he let this chance pass, he would regret it in ways that would accumulate over years until they became unbearable. The interview was brief and practical. The city editor was a man named Carmichael who chain-smoked cigars and spoke in quick bursts of words. He had read the pseudonymous pieces, had figured out they were all by the same person, and he asked direct questions about how stories were sourced and structured and verified. There was no discussion of literature or journalism ethics or larger purposes. Carmichael wanted to know if he could produce usable copy on deadline, if he could work 12-hour days when necessary, if he understood that reporters went where they were sent and wrote what they were told. He answered honestly, downplaying nothing, exaggerating nothing. 2 days later, he received word that he had the job. The pay was barely more than he made at the print shop, and there was no security, no guarantee of continued employment. But it was reporting work, real journalism, and it was the Gazette, a major daily newspaper with circulation across the city. He gave Kowalski 2 weeks' notice, worked those 2 weeks carefully to leave things in good order, and tried not to think too much about what he was walking toward. His mother cried when he told her, but she also held his face in her bent hands and said something she had never said before. She said his father would have been proud, not because of the job itself, but because he was trying to do something that mattered, something beyond mere survival. She did not really understand what newspaper work meant, but she understood ambition and courage. And she saw them in him, and for once she let herself acknowledge them without fear. The newsroom smelled of tobacco smoke and machine oil, of paper and desperation, and something else he could not name, something that tasted metallic on the tongue. It was chaos organized into columns of desks, typewriters clacking like insects, telephones ringing constantly, messengers running between departments with papers and envelopes. Men shouted across the room at each other, argued about stories, debated what belonged on the front page and what could be buried inside. The noise was constant and terrible and magnificent, and he felt terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. Carmichael assigned him to the labor beat, which meant covering worker disputes, strikes, union meetings, and conditions in the industrial neighborhoods. It was considered a secondary beat, less prestigious than politics or crime, but it gave him the freedom to roam the city and talk to people. The first stories he wrote were cautious and stiff, too much deference to authority, too many qualifications. Carmichael marked them up in red pencil and handed them back with terse instructions to write tighter, to find the story in the first paragraph, to trust that readers were intelligent enough to understand implications without being hit over the head with them. He learned quickly, partly from Carmichael's impatient editing, and partly by reading the other reporters' work, paying attention to how experienced journalists structured information, how they moved readers through a story, how they suggested things without quite stating them. Within a few months, his pieces began appearing in better positions in the paper, and his byline became familiar to readers who followed labor news. He was making enough money to help his mother more generously, to rent a slightly better room, to buy books occasionally. The work was absorbing in ways the print shop had never been. Every day was different. One day he was interviewing union organizers about a planned strike at a textile mill. The next he was observing a negotiation between workers and management, watching the choreography of demand and refusal, seeing how power expressed itself in small gestures and careful words. He attended strikes and accidents and mass meetings, and he learned to take notes quickly without being obvious about it, to remember conversations accurately, to reconstruct events from interviews with various participants. More importantly, he learned how the city actually worked beneath its official surfaces. He learned that newspaper stories were not neutral reports of facts, but constructions shaped by access, bias, and pressure. The mill owners had publicists who fed information to reporters they favored. The union organizers had their own stories to promote. City officials decided what information the newspapers could have access to and when. Advertisers could exert pressure on publishers to kill stories or kill coverage of competitors. A reporter had to navigate all of this carefully, deciding what to believe and what to question, understanding that everyone had an interest in how events were framed. He also learned that certain stories could get you killed or beaten, or at least disappeared from the roster of reporters who got good assignments. Stories that seemed to directly criticize the mill owners or suggest systemic problems rather than individual mismanagement. Stories that made the police look bad or suggested corruption in city government. Stories that portrayed workers sympathetically in a way that went beyond simple description. These stories got rejected or heavily edited or printed in ways that buried the most important information on the back pages. One winter night, covering a strike at a steel mill in Homestead, he watched police break up a picket line with clubs. Several men were seriously injured. He interviewed the workers afterward, got their accounts of what happened, got specific details about the police action. He also interviewed the police captain, who gave a different story, saying that the workers had attacked first and the police had responded with appropriate force. He wrote what he had seen, careful to be factual, careful to quote both sides. And the story came back from Carmichael gutted of its most damning details. The final version made both sides sound reasonable and suggested that violence was regrettable but inevitable in these disputes. He went to Carmichael's office angry, questioning the edits, pointing out that witnesses had told him the police initiated the violence. Carmichael looked at him over his reading glasses and explained, without malice, that the Gazette relied on police cooperation for crime reporting, that the mill owners were significant advertisers, that the readers of the newspaper, by and large, agreed with the established order and wanted reassurance that it was being maintained. The newspaper could only push so far against what its audience believed without losing readers and therefore revenue. It was a business, not a crusade. He could work for a newspaper, or he could starve for his principles, but he could not do both. The lesson settled into him like scar tissue, unpleasant but functional. The system was more sophisticated than he had realized. It was not that people were deliberately lying so much as that institutional interests shaped what stories could be told and how they could be told. A competent newspaper had to maintain relationships with sources and advertisers and readers. Challenging those relationships too directly resulted in loss of access and revenue, and eventually loss of the ability to publish anything at all. Compromise was not weakness, but survival, and survival was a prerequisite for being able to do good work at all. But he also understood that within those constraints, a reporter could still tell true things, could still serve readers by noticing what others might miss, could still bear witness, even if the full implications of that witnessing could not always be explicitly stated. A careful reporter could place details in a story that attentive readers would understand, could quote workers in ways that let their own voices convey their situation, could frame official explanations in language that made their inadequacy obvious to anyone paying attention. So he learned to write between the lines, to structure stories so that the most important information came early, to rely on specifics that would resonate with readers who lived the experiences being described. He learned which editors were more sympathetic to labor stories and made sure his best work went to them. He learned to cultivate sources, treating them as partners in journalism rather than simply as information repositories. The workers and union organizers, and even some sympathetic foremen and engineers, began to trust him, to give him information and background because he treated them fairly and never misquoted them or exposed sources to retaliation. By his third year at the Gazette, he had become one of the paper's reliable reporters on labor matters, known in the union halls and worker taverns, respected for his fairness and accuracy. He made a modest living and had settled into a small apartment of his own, decorated sparsely, but kept meticulously clean. He still visited his mother twice a week, though her health continued to decline, and the visits were increasingly difficult, watching her fade and being unable to prevent it. He had no romantic attachments, having learned from Agnes that he could not offer the steady domestic certainty that a decent woman deserved. His life was his work, and his work consumed him. He spent his days in the field gathering stories, and his evenings writing them up, and his rare free time reading newspapers and books about labor history and political economy, trying to understand the larger patterns beneath the individual stories he covered. Then came the fire. It happened on a gray morning in late March at the Monongahela Steelworks in Homestead, a massive complex of furnaces and rolling mills and supporting machinery that employed thousands of workers. The fire started in one of the auxiliary buildings where equipment and materials were stored, and it spread quickly in ways that suggested something terribly wrong with the building's construction or maintenance. Within hours, 37 men were confirmed dead, burned so badly in many cases that they could only be identified by what was left of their clothing or personal possessions. The official cause, according to the company, was a worker's carelessness with a lamp near flammable materials. Carmichael assigned him to cover the story. He went to Homestead early in the afternoon, while the ruins were still smoking, while the families were still arriving, searching for their dead. The devastation was absolute. The building was reduced to a skeleton of twisted metal and blackened wood. Bodies lay on the ground covered with sheets and blankets. Women knelt in the ash and dirt, screaming names. Men stood around with expressions of shock, so profound they seemed to be looking at something beyond what was actually visible. He interviewed the fire captain, who had arrived to find the building already engulfed. He interviewed the surviving workers who had been nearby when the fire started. He interviewed the company spokesman, a thin man with careful eyes, who explained that the building had been old but maintained, that the fire had started in an area with no particular flammable materials, that it was one of those tragic accidents that sometimes happened despite all precautions. He wrote down everything, filled page after page of his notebook with details and quotes and impressions. But he also did something more. He talked to the families of the dead, not in any official capacity, just as a person, offering condolences and listening. An older woman, the widow of one of the dead, told him that her husband had complained for months that equipment in that building was not being maintained properly, that he had mentioned it to the foreman repeatedly and been ignored. Another man, who had worked in the building before being transferred out the week before the fire, said that the building was old and badly ventilated, and it always made him nervous, that several workers had talked about requesting better conditions, but had been afraid to push too hard because jobs were scarce and the company could always find more men. He asked about the lamp, the official cause of the fire. Several workers said that lamps were used constantly in that building and never caused problems, that the lamp explanation did not make sense. A younger worker who had been near the fire when it started said he had heard a loud noise, something that sounded like metal breaking under stress, before he saw any flames. He had not mentioned it to the company representatives, was afraid to, but he told it to the reporter because something about his manner made the young man trust him. That evening, filing his first story from the local telegraph office, he wrote what he had observed: the devastation, the death toll, the worker testimonies suggesting possible safety violations, the company's explanation that did not quite fit with what witnesses described. It was careful writing, nothing that could be directly challenged as false, but the implications were clear to anyone reading carefully. Carmichael cut most of it, keeping only the basic facts and the company's official explanation. The story that appeared on the front page of the Gazette was sympathetic but brief, focusing on the tragedy rather than its causes. But that night, after filing his story, he received something unexpected. A plain envelope was left for him at his boarding house, handed to the landlady by someone she did not see clearly. Inside was a single piece of paper with 3 typewritten words: "Check the bolts." He stared at that paper for a long time, understanding that someone associated with the mill had sent it, someone who knew something about the fire that contradicted the official story, someone who trusted him enough to contact him, or perhaps someone who was simply desperate to tell someone what they knew. The message was cryptic enough that it could be dismissed as a crank note if found, but specific enough to mean something to someone with knowledge of the mill. He spent the next week going back to the mill repeatedly, trying to gain access to what remained of the building, trying to interview more workers privately. The company had cordoned off the area and was restricting access, supposedly for safety reasons. He spoke to the fire investigator, a city official who seemed competent but harried, overwhelmed with other cases and not particularly interested in pursuing questions that contradicted the company's explanation. What he gradually learned from workers who talked to him privately was that the fire had likely started in the area where bolts and fasteners were stored, that there had been recent complaints about the roof of the building leaking badly, that several workers had reported seeing rust and deterioration in the metal supports. The bolts in the anonymous message were likely structural bolts, bolts that were supposed to hold the building together, bolts that had apparently been allowed to corrode despite their obvious importance. He began to understand the pattern. The building was old and had not been properly maintained. The company knew this, or should have known it, because workers had complained. But maintenance cost money, and the building was not part of the main production facilities, so its condition had not been prioritized. The fire might have been started by a lamp, as the company claimed, but it had spread so rapidly and so completely because the building was structurally compromised and filled with flammable materials that should have been stored more safely. Most importantly, the fire had killed 37 men because of negligence, not accident. It was preventable. It should not have happened. And the company was lying about it, or at least being selective with the truth in ways that obscured responsibility. He went to Carmichael with what he had learned, carefully framed, emphasizing that these were worker accounts and needed verification, that he was not making charges, but presenting evidence that suggested the official story was incomplete. Carmichael listened without interrupting, then told him to let it go. The story was covered. The company had provided an explanation. The public had mourned. Moving on was what happened to these events. What had to happen, because there was always another story, always another crisis demanding attention. But when he pushed, when he argued that the evidence suggested something different, Carmichael's expression hardened. He was told, in careful language, that the mill owners were important to the city and to the newspaper, that pursuing accusations of negligence could have consequences, that sometimes a reporter had to accept that the full truth was not printable. If he wanted to keep working at the Gazette, he needed to accept these realities. He left Carmichael's office feeling something shift inside him, a hardening that was different from the professional skepticism he had learned. He understood now that he was meant to forget about the fire, to let it become one more tragedy that the city absorbed and moved past, to accept the official story and stop asking questions. He did not do this. Instead, he kept the anonymous note hidden in his apartment and began investigating quietly, in hours that were not assigned to him, on his own time. He went back to the mill when he could get access, observed the damage to the building, took notes on the structural failures. He interviewed more workers, building a careful picture of how the building had been allowed to deteriorate. He learned the names of the men who had died and visited some of their families, recording their stories, their losses, their understanding of what had caused the fire. Most importantly, he started visiting the local library in the evenings, teaching himself to understand engineering principles, to read technical specifications, to understand how structural failure happened. He wanted to be certain in his understanding, wanted to be able to defend whatever he eventually wrote with facts and analysis that could not be dismissed as mere worker complaints or sentiment. It was exhausting work, conducted in the margins of his actual job, requiring him to file stories about other strikes and labor issues during the day, while pursuing this investigation in secret at night. His apartment became filled with notes and sketches and newspaper clippings. He barely slept, running on coffee and the drive to understand what had happened and why. And all the while he did his job at the Gazette, went to meetings and wrote stories, and maintained his professional reputation. He was living a double life without planning to, simply following where the anonymous note had pointed him, unable to stop despite Carmichael's warning, unable to accept the official story despite its convenient simplicity. The fire had marked something in him, had shown him a failure of journalism that he could not simply overlook, had demonstrated that the truth was more complicated and sometimes more damning than the easy explanations offered by powerful people. He did not yet know what he would do with what he learned, but he knew he could not forget, could not let 37 men be reduced to a careless accident that absolved everyone of responsibility. The investigation consumed him in ways that work never had, in ways that seemed to operate on their own logic, pulling him forward through months of careful accumulation. He learned to compartmentalize, to present one face to Carmichael and his colleagues, while maintaining another life entirely, a life of research and interviews, and slowly assembling evidence. It was not deception so much as survival. And he had learned enough about how the city worked to understand that survival sometimes required strategic compartmentalization. He began spending his evenings in a different tavern, one in the Polish neighborhood where workers from various mills gathered. The Monongahela Steel Works employed men from a dozen ethnic communities, and in the safe space of the tavern, away from company ears, men would talk. Over time, he became a familiar face, someone who bought drinks and listened more than he spoke, someone who could be trusted to use information carefully. They did not know he was a reporter, or, if they suspected it, they did not hold it against him. He was one of them, in the way that mattered, working with his mind instead of his hands, but working nonetheless. The engineer who had likely sent the anonymous note made himself known gradually. His name was Darius Klein, and he had worked for the Monongahela Steel Works for 15 years in a supervisory capacity, responsible for maintenance and safety of the auxiliary buildings. He was a lean man in his 50s, with the careful way of speaking that came from working in a rigid hierarchy, from knowing that a careless word could destroy a career. They began talking in the tavern, conversations that seemed casual at first, becoming gradually more substantive as Klein assessed whether he could be trusted. Klein told him things that confirmed and expanded on what the workers had said. The building had been neglected deliberately, its maintenance deferred so that money could be spent on the main production facilities. Klein had submitted reports documenting the deterioration, had requested funds for repairs, had made it clear in writing that the building was becoming unsafe. All of this had been ignored. The company leadership had looked at the cost of proper maintenance and decided to accept the risk instead. A calculation made in offices by men who would not have to face the consequences if something went wrong. Most damning, Klein provided evidence. He had kept copies of his own maintenance reports, detailed technical documents with dates and specific observations about structural problems. He had photographs of rust and corrosion, of roof damage and deterioration. He had records of worker complaints that had been filed and dismissed. These documents were technically company property, and showing them to a reporter was a breach of contract that could result in legal action, blacklisting, possibly worse. Klein knew this. He was risking everything, and he knew it, and he did it anyway. When Klein first handed him a folder containing copies of these documents, meeting him in a boarding house room that Klein had rented for the purpose, the weight of what was being entrusted to him became fully real. This was not curiosity anymore. This was evidence of negligence, possibly criminal negligence. This was something that could not be unlearned or forgotten. This was something that had to either be published or hidden, and hiding it suddenly felt like complicity. "Why are you doing this?" he asked Klein, though he thought he already knew the answer. "Because 37 men died," Klein said, his voice steady but his hands shaking slightly. "Because if I do not do this, no one will know that it was preventable. Because I am old enough to know that I will not have many more chances to do something that matters." The fear he felt in that moment was significant and clarifying. He understood that by accepting these documents, he was committing himself to something larger than a newspaper story. He was putting Klein at risk. He was putting himself at risk. He was stepping outside the careful bounds that he had learned to respect, the boundaries that kept a reporter employed and breathing. But he also understood that there was no actual choice. He could not accept these documents and then not use them. He could not pretend to believe the official story. He could not let 37 men be reduced to a careless accident that absolved everyone of responsibility. Some lines, once crossed in your own mind, could not be uncrossed. He hid the documents carefully, making duplicates at the library, where a sympathetic librarian did not ask questions, keeping originals in a sealed envelope that he left with his mother, whom he trusted absolutely, and who understood without being told that she was not to mention this to anyone. He continued his regular reporting work, filed his stories about strikes and labor disputes, maintained his reputation at the newspaper as a competent, if somewhat serious, young reporter. But he also started meeting regularly with Klein, going through the documents together, understanding the technical details, learning enough about structural engineering to be able to discuss the issues intelligently. Klein seemed almost relieved to be able to talk openly, to explain to someone what he understood about the failure that had killed so many men. Their meetings became something like a partnership, though Klein never quite acknowledged this directly. They were simply two men meeting in rented rooms to discuss matters that had to be discussed carefully. He also began meeting with a woman named Margaret Chen, who worked for a settlement house in the industrial neighborhoods. She had been involved in workers' education and advocacy, and she had interviewed many of the families of the men who died in the fire. She had a list of names and stories, and she was willing to introduce him to people who would talk. Through Margaret, he met widows and children and siblings of the dead, people whose lives had been shattered by an event that was being officially dismissed as an unfortunate accident. Margaret was unusual among the people he had met in Pittsburgh society. She was educated and articulate, and moved easily between different social classes because she genuinely did not acknowledge the boundaries that were supposed to separate them. She had studied social conditions in other cities, had read the emerging literature about industrial accidents and workers' safety, and she had a sophisticated understanding of how the system worked. More importantly, she cared deeply about the people she worked with, not in a sentimental way, but with a kind of rigorous compassion that insisted they be treated as fully human and fully responsible for their own lives. They began working together informally, she providing access to people and contexts, he providing documentation and journalistic framing. It was not a romantic relationship, though he found himself drawn to her in ways that complicated his focus on the work. She was not interested in romance, was more interested in the investigation and what it might accomplish. Over time, they developed a kind of partnership that had elements of friendship, but was primarily united by shared purpose. Through his connection with Margaret, he learned about the broader patterns of industrial accidents and safety violations across Pittsburgh. The Monongahela fire was not an isolated incident. It was part of a system. Across the mills and foundries and auxiliary facilities, there were constant small failures and occasional catastrophic ones. Workers died regularly from preventable causes. Companies cut corners on maintenance and safety. Workers had no recourse because they could be replaced easily, and because the legal system did not recognize workers' rights as mattering much compared to property rights and business freedom. This larger understanding changed how he thought about the story he was pursuing. It was not simply about one negligent company and one preventable fire. It was about a system in which human life was valued less than production efficiency and profit margins. It was about a city that celebrated its industrial prowess while accepting the human cost as simply the price of progress. It was about a legal and social framework that protected property and ownership while leaving workers vulnerable to injury and death. More than a year had passed since the fire when he felt ready to write. He had accumulated enough evidence, conducted enough interviews, built a comprehensive enough understanding that he could write something that would be difficult to dismiss. He had learned enough about the technical issues to defend his analysis. He had enough testimony from workers and Klein's engineering documentation to prove that the official story was false. But he also knew that publishing this story would destroy Klein's career, and possibly his freedom. It might create problems for Margaret and the settlement house. It might result in legal action against him and the Gazette. It would definitely change his professional standing, would mark him as someone willing to challenge the established order, would make him an enemy to powerful people who did not forgive such challenges. He went to Carmichael with a preliminary proposal, framing it as a potential series exploring industrial safety across Pittsburgh. He did not mention the Monongahela fire specifically. He did not mention that he had obtained company documents. He simply suggested that there was a story worth exploring, that workers' safety was an issue the newspaper could cover more thoroughly, that there might be real public interest in understanding how accidents happened and whether they were truly inevitable. Carmichael listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker as the proposal continued. When he finished, Carmichael told him no. Told him that this was precisely the kind of story that would create problems with the mill owners and the Chamber of Commerce. Told him that the newspaper could not afford this kind of investigation. Carmichael was not unkind about it. He simply explained the realities. The newspaper depended on advertising revenue from companies that would not advertise in a newspaper that investigated their safety practices. The political leadership of the city would consider such investigation to be a tax on the city itself. The readers of the Gazette were not primarily workers, but businessmen and professionals who wanted to read about successful enterprises, not failures. "You can write about labor disputes," Carmichael told him. "You can cover strikes and organize and workers' demands, but you cannot publish material that suggests the system itself is corrupt. We do not operate outside the system. We cannot afford to." It was the clearest statement of the newspaper's actual constraints that he had received, and it settled something in him. He understood now that he could not expect the Gazette to publish this story. Not now, and not in any form that would include the full truth he had uncovered. The newspaper was an institution operating within the existing order, and that order did not permit challenges to the fundamental structure of industrial capitalism. He had a choice. He could accept this limitation and return to his regular reporting work, or he could pursue the story knowing that it would have to be published elsewhere, if it was published at all. He could protect his career at the Gazette, or he could pursue the truth. But he could not do both. The decision came to him almost without conscious deliberation. He gave Carmichael his resignation, effective immediately, and walked out of the Gazette building, knowing that he had just ended his career at a major newspaper, possibly his career in mainstream journalism entirely. He was 28 years old, and he had just made himself unemployable to anyone who valued his own interests over his principles, and he felt terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. His mother, when he told her what had happened, did not say, "I told you so," or express anger at his foolishness. She simply wept a little and held his face and said that his father would have done the same thing. She did not understand the details of industrial safety or journalistic ethics, but she understood defiance in the face of injustice, and she recognized it in her son's decision. For the next several months, he lived off his savings and occasional work doing typesetting for various print shops, work he could pick up and put down as needed. He continued his research and interviews, expanded his investigation to include not just the Monongahela fire, but documentation of safety failures across multiple facilities. He met regularly with Klein and Margaret, refining the analysis, building the case methodically. Margaret introduced him to other activists and reformers, people who had been working on labor issues and industrial conditions from different angles. Some were clergy, some were academics, some were simply people who had witnessed the devastation of industrial accidents and decided to do something about it. Through these connections, he began to understand that there was a world beyond the mainstream newspapers, a world of reform publications and radical press and academic journals, where different kinds of stories could be told. But he also understood that publishing the story was not the same as accomplishing anything. The story had to be not just true, but compelling and accessible and impossible to ignore. It had to reach people who could do something about it, people with political power or economic influence. It had to be told in a way that forced acknowledgement and response, rather than being easily dismissible as radical propaganda. All of this took time, took thought, took the kind of careful, strategic consideration that was normally applied to business and politics, but rarely to journalism. He was learning to think like an activist, while maintaining the standards of accuracy and evidence that he had been trained to maintain as a reporter. It was a difficult synthesis, but it was the only way he could imagine telling this story in a way that might actually matter. The betrayal came from a direction he had not anticipated, from someone he had made the mistake of trusting completely. His name was Robert Hastings, a reporter at the Gazette whom he had known for years, had considered a friend. Hastings was a few years older, had taken him under his wing when he first started at the newspaper, had shared advice about the business and the city. They had drunk together in reporters' bars and discussed politics and philosophy, or at least what passed for it among newspapermen. When he left the Gazette, Hastings had expressed sympathetic understanding, had said he envied the courage it took to walk away from steady employment. 3 months into his investigation, while he was living quietly on dwindling savings and working occasional typesetting jobs, he met Hastings by chance at a coffee shop. Hastings suggested they have lunch, and over sandwiches and coffee, he found himself talking. Not about the documents or the specific evidence, but about the general direction of his thinking, about industrial safety being a significant public health issue, about the way accidents were being systematically misrepresented. Hastings listened with apparent interest and concern. He asked intelligent questions. He seemed sympathetic to the argument that the system was rigged against workers. They talked for 2 hours, and when they parted, Hastings told him he was doing important work, that he admired the integrity it took to pursue truth without institutional support. He seemed genuine. He seemed like a friend. 3 days later, a man came to his boarding house in the morning, a man in an expensive suit with cold eyes and the manner of someone accustomed to having authority. The man represented the Monongahela Steelworks and was there to inform him that he had obtained confidential company documents illegally, that this constituted theft and a serious breach of contract law, and that if any of this material was published or distributed further, the company would pursue legal action against him personally for damages that could include not just financial penalties, but criminal charges. The man did not threaten him directly. He simply outlined the legal reality with the precision of someone who had studied law carefully. He knew his name. He knew where he lived. He knew the general nature of his investigation. The company, he explained, had learned about these activities through sources within the city, and they wanted to make clear that there would be consequences for any attempt to harm the company's reputation or operations. After the man left, he sat for a long time without moving, understanding what had happened. Hastings had sold him, had taken everything he had said and reported it to people who had connections to the mill owners. The threat was implicit but clear. Stop investigating, or face legal prosecution that could destroy his life. The company did not even need to prove he had stolen the documents. The mere fact of legal action, of defending himself in court, would consume all his resources and energy, and would warn off anyone else who might have been considering helping him. He wanted to rage, to confront Hastings, to make him explain what he had done and why. But that would accomplish nothing, except to provide satisfaction in the moment and problems afterward. Instead, he did what he had been trained to do. He assessed the situation rationally and tried to determine what could be salvaged. The immediate problem was the documents. If the company's lawyers obtained them, the evidence would be removed from his control. If they were discovered in his apartment, they could be seized. He went to his mother's house, retrieved the sealed envelope he had left with her, and moved the documents to a new hiding place, a storage space he rented under a false name at a warehouse on the south side. He made additional copies, hiding sets of documents in different locations, in case one cache was discovered and seized. More fundamental was the question of whether he could continue the investigation at all. The legal threat was serious. He had no money for lawyers. A trial would be conducted in a city where the industrial leadership wielded significant influence over the judiciary. He would lose, and he would lose catastrophically. But he also understood that the threat worked only if he was intimidated by it, only if he stopped. If he continued quietly, completed the investigation, and found a way to publish the findings, the company's threat would be exposed as an attempt to suppress the truth. Publishing the story would be protection in its own way. Because once the story was public, prosecuting him for publishing it would confirm that the company was trying to silence him. The real problem was that he had no publication venue. The mainstream newspapers would not touch the story. The reform press he had begun to connect with was small and underfunded and reached a limited audience. He needed a platform that had both credibility and reach, and that was not available to him. For weeks, he moved through a kind of depression, a gray paralysis in which he continued his research mechanically, but without hope that it would matter. He worked typesetting jobs that barely paid for his room and food. He avoided seeing people, avoided explaining what had happened, wrapped himself in isolation and apparent industry. His mother worried, but she gave him space to work through whatever burden he was carrying. Then Klein came to see him, coming to his boarding house on a Sunday evening with news that was both encouraging and terrifying. Klein had been contacted by lawyers representing workers who had died in the fire. A lawsuit was being prepared against the Monongahela Steelworks, and the lawyers wanted to interview Klein about his maintenance reports and his knowledge of the building's condition. Someone had put the lawyers in touch with Klein, had suggested that he had evidence that was relevant to the case. Klein did not know who had made that suggestion, but he suspected it came from Margaret, or someone in her network. The lawyers were representing the families pro bono, working on the case because they believed in it, rather than because it was profitable. They were building a civil lawsuit against the company, arguing that the negligence in maintaining the building had resulted in wrongful death, and seeking damages and an injunction against the company's continued unsafe practices. "This changes things," Klein told him. "If there is a lawsuit, the discovery process means documents have to be revealed. The company cannot simply suppress evidence if it is part of a legal proceeding. Your documents become evidence in court, and they become protected because they are part of the legal process." He understood what Klein was suggesting. If the lawsuit proceeded, his investigation could be connected to it, could be made part of the legal record, could be protected by the legal system, even though the system usually protected powerful interests. It was an improbable path, but it was a path. He met with the lawyers, a team of 3 who worked out of a small office near the courthouse. They were serious and meticulous, treating the case as both a matter of justice and of law. They listened to his account of the investigation, examined his documents and notes, asked tough questions about sources and reliability. They did not take him at his word. They verified everything, contacted people independently, built their own case in parallel with his investigation. Over the next several months, the investigation became part of legal discovery. He cooperated with the lawyers, providing his research and helping them understand the technical issues. He also continued his own work, deepening the investigation, finding more sources, building a more comprehensive picture of the systematic negligence that had led to the fire. But the lawsuit also meant that he had to be more careful. He could not publish anything that might compromise the legal case. The company's lawyers would use any public statements he made against him and against the plaintiffs. He had to stay silent while other people used his work, which was its own kind of agony. The knowledge that he had uncovered the truth but could not speak it. The legal process moved slowly, grinding through procedural steps and discovery disputes. The company's lawyers fought every request for documents, argued that maintenance records were proprietary business information, suggested that the workers' negligence had been the actual cause of the fire. The case became more complicated as it proceeded, as more people became involved and more legal questions had to be resolved. During this period, he had little money and no clear prospects. He continued doing typesetting work, which was irregular and poorly paid. His mother's health declined further, and he was not able to afford proper medical care for her. One winter, she developed pneumonia, and he sat with her for 3 days and nights, knowing that she might die and being unable to prevent it. She recovered, but the experience sobered him about what he was really accomplishing with his investigation. He was sacrificing his livelihood, his financial security, his ability to provide for his mother, all in pursuit of justice that might never materialize, that might be buried in legal technicalities, or bought off by the company settling with the families for a sum that would be called closure, but would really be silence. He was choosing principle over survival, and he was doing it while people who depended on him suffered the consequences. His isolation deepened during these months. He had pushed away the friendships he had maintained from his days at the Gazette. He could not afford to socialize. He was suspicious now of people's motives, having been betrayed by someone he had trusted. He spent his free time in his rented room, reading and thinking and writing notes that he would probably never publish, documenting not just the fire and its causes, but his own journey through the investigation and what it was costing him. Margaret remained in contact, checking on him periodically, bringing news of how the lawsuit was progressing. But even Margaret seemed distant now, caught up in her own work and her own preoccupations. There was no romantic element to their relationship, and he was not sure there ever had been beyond his own wishful thinking. They were colleagues, united by a cause, and as long as the cause had momentum, they were connected. But that connection was conditional and contingent. One evening, 6 months after the threatening visit from the company's representative, he received another visitor at his boarding house. This one was different. It was an older woman, the widow of one of the men who had died in the fire. Her name was Sarah Kowalski, and she brought with her copies of letters her husband had written to her, letters written the week before his death, in which he had expressed his fears about the safety of the building where he worked. She had learned about him through the lawsuit, through the lawyers who had mentioned his investigation. She had come to give him the letters, to help him understand what her husband had been thinking in those final days. She told him that the settlement the lawyers were negotiating with the company seemed likely to go through, that the company was willing to pay money rather than face a trial where the full extent of their negligence would be made public. "I do not care about the money," she told him, her voice steady, but her hands trembling. "I care that people know what happened, that they understand that my husband's death was not an accident, but a consequence of choices made by people who valued money over human life. I care that the company does not get to bury this and pretend it never happened." Hearing this, feeling the weight of her need and her grief, he understood what he had to do. He could not wait for the legal process to finish. He could not let the company settle the case and suppress the truth. He had to publish what he had found, had to tell the story in a way that could not be ignored or suppressed. He had to do it knowing that it might damage the lawsuit, might provide the company's lawyers with material to use against the plaintiffs, might compromise the legal case that was his best chance of accomplishing anything at all. But he also understood that if he did not publish, he would be choosing the legal case over the truth, would be accepting that justice meant financial compensation rather than public knowledge. He would be accepting that the system worked the way it was supposed to work, that powerful interests got to control the narrative about what happened. After Sarah Kowalski left, he sat for a long time making a decision that felt both inevitable and impossible. He would write the story, the full account of the Monongahela fire and its causes and the company's negligence. He would find a way to publish it, even if it meant publishing it in some small reformist magazine that reached only a few hundred people. He would do this because he could not do it, because the alternative was a kind of complicity he could not bear. The decision brought a strange peace, the sense of finally acting rather than simply enduring. He began to write, pouring out everything he had learned, everything he understood about the fire and the system that had created it. He wrote with care and precision, supporting every claim with evidence, making sure that the story was not just emotionally compelling, but factually unassailable. He wrote, knowing that this story, once published, would define the rest of his life, would mark him as someone willing to challenge power, would make him permanently unemployable in mainstream journalism. The small reform newspaper was called the Pittsburgh People's Voice, and it occupied a cramped office above a butcher shop in the Strip District, where the smell of meat and sawdust drifted up through the floorboards. The editor was a man named Samuel Brenner, a former minister who had left the church over disagreements about whether religion should challenge social injustice or simply console people within it. Brenner had chosen challenge, and he had been running the newspaper on a shoestring budget for 7 years, covering stories that the mainstream press ignored. speaking to an audience that mostly wanted confirmation of what they already believed, rather than information that might change their minds. Brenner read the manuscript he had written in a single sitting, smoking thin cigars and making occasional notes. When he finished, he looked up with an expression that combined skepticism and something like hunger. He asked whether the documents were verified, whether the sources would stand up to scrutiny, whether he understood the legal implications of publishing accusations of negligence against a powerful company. He asked these questions not as obstacles, but as a reporter would ask them, making sure the story was sound before committing to it. When he answered yes to each question, providing documentation and explaining his methodology, Brenner nodded slowly and said he would publish it, not all at once, but as a series, 8 parts that would run weekly starting the following Sunday. It would be the longest investigative piece the newspaper had ever run, and it would likely anger every powerful person in Pittsburgh and possibly result in legal action against both him and the newspaper. "Why would you do this?" he asked Brenner, genuinely curious about the calculation that could lead someone to invite that kind of trouble. Brenner smiled slightly. "Because the newspaper exists to tell truth that other people will not tell. Because if we do not publish this, what is the point of existing at all? Because 37 men are dead, and their deaths have been reduced to an accident, and someone has to say that it was not an accident." The series began to appear on Sunday mornings, dense with documentation and careful argument, meticulously sourced and impossible to dismiss as mere opinion or speculation. The first installment laid out the facts of the fire itself, the timeline, and the physical evidence. The second examined the building's structural condition and the maintenance records. The third presented testimony from workers who had complained about safety conditions. The fourth introduced Klein's technical analysis. The fifth analyzed the company's official story and showed where it diverged from the evidence. The sixth explored the system of negligence that extended beyond this one building to other company facilities. The seventh connected it to broader patterns across Pittsburgh industry. The eighth drew conclusions and called for specific regulatory reforms. Each installment was accompanied by reproductions of documents, photographs of the building, diagrams of structural failure. The writing was clear and compelling, but rigorously factual. There were no adjectives that were not earned, no claims that were not supported, no emotional appeals beyond the bare facts of what had happened and what it meant. The response was immediate and multifaceted. The mainstream newspapers either ignored the series or published brief dismissals, noting that it was the work of a radical publication and therefore not worthy of serious consideration. The company's lawyers sent a letter threatening legal action for libel. But the lawyers also seemed to understand that they had a problem. Everything in the series was factually accurate and well documented, making it difficult to pursue a libel case without having to defend the company's conduct in court. More surprisingly, the series created momentum among workers and reformers. Copies of the installments were reproduced and distributed in union halls. They were read aloud at workers' meetings. They became reference material for activists pushing for safety reforms. Political figures who had been sympathetic to labor concerns began to cite the series in speeches and legislative proposals. The story had found its audience, not the general public necessarily, but the audience that mattered for creating pressure for change. Klein, who had been living in fear of retaliation, experienced something like vindication. The publication of his analysis in a newspaper, even a small one, gave him a kind of protection. The company could not fire him for documents that were already published, though they could and did transfer him to a less desirable position. More importantly, his role as a source became known, and within activist and reform circles, he became respected for his willingness to speak truth. He eventually left the company entirely and found work with a consulting firm that helped workers and reform organizations understand industrial safety issues. Margaret's settlement house became a gathering place for discussing the series and its implications. She organized reading groups and discussion forums, bringing together workers and activists and sympathetic clergy and academics. The settlement house was already a space where different classes and ethnicities mixed to some degree, and the series gave it a focus, a shared project that all the various people involved could unite around. For him, the publication brought a strange mixture of relief and emptiness. The investigation was complete. The story was told. But there was no employment waiting for him on the other side of it. No position as a successful investigative journalist at a major newspaper. Instead, he had become a kind of marked man, someone known to have challenged the established order, someone who would have difficulty finding work in mainstream journalism or most other professional fields. Brenner, however, offered him a job. The newspaper was small and could not pay much, barely enough to live on. But Brenner wanted him to become the newspaper's investigative reporter, to pursue other stories with the same rigor and care he had brought to the Monongahela fire. He would be working in a publication with limited reach and limited resources, but with editorial freedom and a mission to expose injustice. It was not the career he had imagined, but it was work that mattered, and it was work that he could do without compromising what he had learned about truth and responsibility. His mother died during the second week of the series' publication, peacefully in her sleep, having lived long enough to see her son's work appear in print, having lived long enough to know that he had chosen principle over security. He wept at her funeral, wept not just for her death, but for all the years she had struggled, for all the sacrifices she had made, for the fact that his success, such as it was, came too late to make her final years more comfortable. But he also wept with gratitude that she had known before she died that he had done something that mattered. The funeral was attended by a surprising mix of people. Neighbors from Polish Hill, who had known his mother for decades. Colleagues from his days at the Gazette, some of whom came to pay respects, and some of whom came out of curiosity about what he had become. Workers who had read the series and come to honor both him and the woman who had raised him. Even Carmichael came, standing in the back of the church with an expression that was difficult to read. Perhaps regret, perhaps simply acknowledgement of a path not taken. After his mother's death, the apartment that had been his anchor and his responsibility became simply his grief. He spent a week in that space, going through her few possessions, finding the letters she had saved from his father, finding small things he had made for her as a child. He found notes she had written to herself, practical calculations about money and rent, but also occasional lines that expressed her pride in him, her fear for him, her hopes that he would find a life that gave him peace. He packed up most of what she had owned, gave away her clothes to women in the neighborhood who had been her friends, kept only a few items that felt essential to preserve. When he left the apartment for the last time, he left the key with the landlady and walked away from a building that had been the center of his world for most of his life. It was a physical enactment of something that was already happening psychologically. He was leaving behind the working-class world of his childhood, entering something different, something more dangerous and less bounded. Working for Brenner's newspaper meant pursuing stories that the mainstream press would not touch. He investigated safety conditions at other mills and foundries. He documented wage theft and fraudulent accounting practices that left workers without promised pay. He wrote about the conditions in tenements, about disease and overcrowding and exploitation by landlords. He conducted interviews with injured workers, with widows of men who had died, with children who worked instead of attending school. The work was emotionally draining in ways his earlier reporting had not been. At the Gazette, he had maintained a professional distance, had accepted that newspaper work required a kind of detachment from the human suffering being described. At the People's Voice, that detachment was impossible. The people he was interviewing were not sources providing information for a story. They were people whose lives had been destroyed or diminished by systems of exploitation, and their stories were not abstract problems, but concrete suffering. Margaret worked with him on many of these stories, providing access to networks and introducing him to people who might talk. Their partnership deepened into something more complex than simple collaboration, a sharing of purpose and vision and daily struggle. But it remained fundamentally professional, focused on the work rather than on personal connection. He sometimes wondered whether this was because Margaret had no romantic interest in him, or because they were both so consumed by the work that personal relationships seemed like a luxury they could not afford. He did not ask, and Margaret did not explain, and the ambiguity became part of the texture of their relationship. 18 months after his mother's death, a development came that changed the trajectory of his work. The lawsuit filed by the families of the Monongahela fire victims came to trial, and his published series became evidence in the courtroom. The company's lawyers tried to have it excluded, arguing that it was biased and inflammatory, but the judge allowed it as documentation of the facts of the case. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and it became the defining moment in Pittsburgh labor history to that point. Klein testified about the maintenance records and the structural failures. Workers testified about their complaints and their warnings that had been ignored. Lawyers representing the families presented the evidence methodically, building an irrefutable case that the fire had been caused by the company's negligence in maintaining the building. The company's lawyers argued that workers bore responsibility for following safety practices, but they could not credibly deny the basic facts. The building had been allowed to deteriorate. The company had known this, and the deterioration had contributed directly to the fire's spread and its deadly consequences. The jury deliberated for 2 days and returned a verdict in favor of the plaintiffs. The company was ordered to pay damages to the families and was enjoined from continuing certain unsafe practices across its operations. It was not the sweeping victory that reformers might have hoped for. The damages were calculated based on the lost earnings of the deceased workers, which were modest because their wages had been low. But it was a victory nonetheless. A public acknowledgement that the company had been negligent, a precedent that other injured workers could potentially use in pursuing their own cases. More importantly, the trial vindicated the investigation. The story that had been published in the People's Voice had been proven accurate in a court of law by a jury of ordinary citizens who had reviewed the evidence and found it convincing. This gave the newspaper credibility that it would not otherwise have had, gave it standing to pursue other investigations with the confidence that its work mattered and that the facts it documented could withstand scrutiny. The victory also changed something in the broader landscape of Pittsburgh politics. The trial had brought public attention to industrial safety issues in a way that they had not previously received. Politicians who had been ignoring labor concerns began to pay attention. Reform-minded legislators started drafting safety legislation. The newspapers that had previously dismissed the story began to take labor issues more seriously, began to investigate conditions in their own shallow ways, following the path that he had marked more thoroughly. Over the following year, inspired by the trial and the public attention it had generated, he pursued other investigations. He documented the conditions in the coke ovens, where workers were regularly burned and poisoned by fumes. He investigated accident rates in specific mills and showed that some companies had substantially higher injury and death rates than others, suggesting that differences in safety practices mattered. He wrote about children working in mills and factories, their small bodies damaged by machinery designed for adults. Each investigation followed the same methodology: careful documentation, verification of sources, building a comprehensive picture rather than relying on isolated examples. Each story was published in the People's Voice, and then gradually picked up by other papers and reformers. Each story contributed to a growing sense that industrial conditions needed to be changed, that workers' safety was not simply a matter of individual responsibility, but was a systemic problem requiring systemic solutions. During this period, he began to mentor younger reporters, people who wanted to do investigative work but had come through different paths than he had. Brenner hired them to expand the newspaper's capacity, and he worked with them, teaching them the same methodology he had developed: how to source stories, how to verify information, how to structure complex narratives, how to present evidence in ways that were compelling without being manipulative. This teaching work gave him something he had not expected: a sense of continuity and purpose beyond any single story. He understood that he was building not just a narrative about specific events, but a way of approaching journalism, a model for how reporters could investigate power and speak truth without abandoning rigor or care. He was creating a legacy that would outlast any individual story. By the time he was 34, a shift had occurred in Pittsburgh's public discourse about industrial conditions. It was not complete, and much of the establishment still resisted reform, but the conversation had changed. Newspapers that had previously ignored labor issues were now covering them. Politicians were debating safety legislation. Workers' organizations were emboldened to push for better conditions. The investigation into the Monongahela fire, which had seemed like an isolated challenge to established power, had become the catalyst for broader change. None of this had happened quickly or easily, and he bore the scars of the struggle. He had sacrificed financial security, had lost years of his life to single investigations, had made enemies among the powerful, and had received threats that he tried not to think about too carefully. But he had also found a purpose that sustained him, had discovered that there was value in bearing witness, in documenting truth, in refusing to accept official stories that did not match reality. The investigation into the broader safety failures across Pittsburgh's steel industry began with a death that was officially ruled suicide, but which carried all the markers of something far more deliberate. A young engineer named Thomas Weller who had been cooperating with reformers and providing technical analysis of safety violations at multiple mills, was found at the bottom of a ravine in the hills east of the city. The official narrative was that he had jumped, that he had been despondent about personal matters. The facts, as they emerged through careful investigation, suggested something different. Weller had been meeting with him to discuss evidence of systematic falsification of safety inspection documents across multiple company facilities. The revelation that inspection records were being deliberately falsified changed everything. It meant that the negligence was not simply a matter of companies choosing not to spend money on maintenance and safety. It meant that companies were actively concealing violations, creating false documents to suggest that inspections had been conducted and passed when they had not been. It meant that the system itself, not just individual companies, but the regulatory apparatus itself, was corrupted. He began to investigate immediately, working with Klein and with Margaret, following the trail of forged documents backward to discover who had created them and under what pressure. The investigation took months, required him to interview inspectors and officials, and document falsifiers to piece together a system of corruption that went higher and deeper than he had initially understood. It involved not just the mill owners, but city officials and state regulators who had chosen to accept bribes and falsified documents rather than enforce safety standards. The work was dangerous in ways his earlier investigations had not been. Pursuing the Monongahela fire had meant investigating a specific event and a specific company. Pursuing the inspection falsification scandal meant attacking the entire system, meant suggesting that regulatory agencies themselves were compromised. He received threats more explicit than before. He was followed by men whose purpose was clearly intimidation. One night his apartment was broken into and ransacked, with nothing stolen but with a clear message left. They knew where he lived, and they were watching. Klein became increasingly frightened, understanding that his role in the earlier investigation had marked him as a source, and that pursuing deeper investigations would increase the danger. Klein eventually decided to leave Pittsburgh entirely, moving to a smaller city in Ohio where he could work quietly as a consulting engineer, away from the sphere of the large mills and their reach. Before he left, he gave him additional documents, engineering records that showed systematic problems across multiple facilities, records that Klein had been collecting for years but had been afraid to reveal until the investigation into the fire had given him some sense of protection. Margaret suggested they work together differently on this investigation, trying to verify information through legal means rather than through confidential documents that could be seized. They began filing requests for public records, information that companies and government agencies were supposed to provide. Most requests were denied on various technical grounds, but occasionally, through bureaucratic oversight or through sympathetic officials who had become concerned about the scope of the corruption, documents emerged that supported their investigation. The most significant breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a young woman named Eleanor Walsh, who worked as a secretary in the city building department. She had become disgusted by the casual way that safety violations were being ignored, by the bribes that were routinely offered and accepted, by the falsified records that she was sometimes asked to help create. She reached out to Margaret through a contact at the settlement house, indicating that she had information and was willing to talk. Eleanor provided him with access to records that documented systematic violations going back years. She showed him how requests for enforcement had been filed and then buried.
She explained the mechanism by which bribes worked, how much was typically paid, which officials were involved. She was taking enormous risk in providing this information, was potentially committing a crime by removing documents from her workplace, was definitely ending any possibility of a future career in city government. When he asked her why she was doing this, why she was risking so much, she told him something similar to what Klein had said years before. She said that she could not live with herself if she continued to be part of a system that allowed people to die for profit. She said that she wanted to be able to look at herself in the mirror without shame. She said that sometimes you had to choose what mattered more, your own security or the possibility of preventing harm to others. The investigation expanded to include not just inspection falsification, but the entire ecosystem of corruption. He documented patterns of how bribes were offered, how amounts varied depending on the severity of violations, how certain officials had become wealthy on the proceeds of bribes in a way that was obvious to anyone looking carefully at their spending versus their official salaries. He connected the corruption to specific deaths and injuries that might have been prevented if violations had been properly reported and addressed. Writing the investigation required even more care than the Monongahela Fire series had required. He had to be absolutely certain of facts, because the accusations were now even more serious, because he was naming specific officials and suggesting criminal activity. He worked with Brenner to ensure that every claim could be substantiated, that every document was verified, that every piece of testimony came from sources he trusted and could account for. The series was titled The Price of Silence and ran in 12 installments over 3 months. Each installment focused on a different aspect of the corruption: how inspection documents were falsified, how bribes were offered and paid, how specific officials had become wealthy, how specific deaths had resulted from violations that had been covered up. The final installment provided a comprehensive accounting of the system and called for specific reforms: the establishment of an independent safety inspectorate, criminal penalties for falsifying records, prosecution of officials who had accepted bribes. The response was immediate and intense. The newspapers that had begun to take labor issues seriously after the Monongahela trial now had to confront evidence that government itself was corrupt. Some newspapers attacked the series as radical propaganda. Others, particularly younger reporters and editors who had been influenced by the earlier investigation, pursued their own reporting to verify the allegations. The city government went into crisis mode, with multiple investigations being launched and officials scrambling to distance themselves from the accusations. Most significantly, the series brought down 3 city officials directly. The building inspector was forced to resign, and evidence emerged that suggested he had accepted bribes totaling more than $50,000 over the course of a decade. 2 other officials in related agencies also resigned or were removed. Criminal investigations were initiated, though the actual prosecutions moved slowly through a legal system that was itself part of the corrupt network he had exposed. The mill owners responded with coordinated pressure on the newspaper. Advertisers were pressured to withdraw. Brenner received visits from lawyers, making veiled threats. The building where the newspaper office was located suddenly had problems with its plumbing and electrical systems that were expensive to fix. But Brenner refused to back down or to apologize for the reporting. and the newspaper's circulation actually increased as readers came to understand that they were reading journalism that mattered, that was willing to challenge power. He received the most direct threats during this period. A man followed him for several days and made clear that he was being followed. Another incident occurred where someone threw a brick through his apartment window. He was beaten once by men he did not recognize, a professional job that left him with bruises but no permanent injuries, clearly meant to send a message rather than to seriously harm him. Each incident increased his awareness of how much danger he was in, how seriously the people he had exposed took his threat to their interests. He also became aware of watching, of being surveilled. He noticed the same men appearing in different locations, clearly assigned to track his movements. He understood that they were gathering information about his sources, his meetings, his habits, building intelligence that could be used against him if and when they decided to act. This awareness made him more careful, made him vary his patterns, made him consider whether to go to the authorities for protection, and deciding that the authorities themselves were part of the problem. Margaret became increasingly worried about his safety, suggesting that he should leave Pittsburgh for a time, should go somewhere that the people threatening him could not reach him. He refused, understanding that leaving would be seen as defeat, would damage his credibility with his sources and his readers, would suggest that he could be intimidated into silence. But he also understood that Margaret was right to worry, that he was taking risks that were perhaps excessive, that the physical safety that he had taken for granted his entire life was no longer guaranteed. During the months that the corruption series was running, Carmichael came to see him. The former editor had left the Gazette by this point and was working as a consultant to newspaper publishers on business matters. He arrived at the People's Voice office unannounced and asked to speak to him privately. They sat in the small conference room that the newspaper used, and Carmichael told him something he had not expected to hear. Carmichael explained that he had regretted his refusal to publish the Monongahela investigation years before. He said that at the time, he had been thinking about the newspaper's institutional interests, about the need to maintain relationships with powerful people. He said that he had been right about the institutional realities, but wrong about what the newspaper should have done with that knowledge. He said that newspapers had a responsibility to tell truth, even when it was costly, even when it meant losing advertisers and readers, because that responsibility was what gave journalism any legitimacy or purpose. More than that, Carmichael explained, the decision to suppress the story had bothered him in a way that had affected everything else in his career. He had compromised with his conscience, and he had never been able to uncompromise it. He had gone on to become a more senior editor, had made more money, had built a successful career in newspaper management, but he had done it all while knowing that he had chosen security over truth at a moment when truth mattered. "I am telling you this," Carmichael said, "because I see you making a different choice. I see you sacrificing security for truth, and I see it costing you. I want you to know that you are right to do this, even if it costs you everything." I did not have the courage to make that choice, but I see it being made now, and I want to make sure you understand that it matters, that you matter. After Carmichael left, he sat for a long time, thinking about what the former editor had said. It occurred to him that this was a kind of validation from an unexpected source, from someone who had been in a position of institutional power and had chosen to use it conservatively, but who had lived to regret that choice. Carmichael was offering retrospective blessing
for a choice that he himself had not been able to make. The investigation reached its legal conclusion in the courtroom when one of the officials who had accepted bribes was prosecuted and convicted. The trial was not as dramatic as the Monongahela lawsuit had been, because the corruption was more diffuse and systemic, because fewer individual victims could be identified and brought forward. But it was significant nonetheless, a validation that the reporting had been accurate and substantive enough to serve as the basis for actual criminal prosecution. The verdict brought the investigation into the public narrative in a way that opinion and accusation had not done. The convicted official was sentenced to 3 years in prison, a relatively light sentence that disappointed reformers, but represented nonetheless an unprecedented prosecution of corruption in Pittsburgh government. More important than the sentence was the fact that the investigation had established the pattern, had demonstrated that corruption was systematic rather than individual, had created a basis for demanding broader reforms. In the months following the trial, a state legislative commission was established to investigate safety practices across Pennsylvania's industries. The commission hired him as a consultant and researcher, giving him a quasi-official platform from which to investigate and make recommendations. The work was less dramatic than newspaper journalism, but perhaps more consequential in terms of actual reform. He conducted interviews with workers and engineers, analyzed technical records, studied practices in other states that had enacted stronger safety legislation. The Commission's final report, released nearly 2 years after the corruption investigation began, recommended comprehensive reforms to Pennsylvania's industrial safety regulations. It called for the establishment of a state-level safety inspectorate, independent from local political influence. It recommended criminal penalties for falsifying safety records. It suggested stronger requirements for mill owners to maintain equipment and report accidents accurately. Not all of the recommendations were immediately enacted, but they became the baseline for a decade of legislative reform, gradually reshaping how industrial safety was understood and regulated in the state. By the time the legislative work concluded, he was 36 years old, no longer young but not quite middle-aged, hardened by years of investigation and threat, but also sustained by the sense that the work was meaningful. He had become known not just in Pittsburgh, but across the country as an investigative journalist willing to take on powerful interests. Other newspapers contacted him with job offers, suggesting that he might want to return to mainstream journalism with the credibility and reputation he had built. He declined these offers, preferring to continue working with Brenner's newspaper, preferring the independence and the mission to the security and prestige that a larger publication could have offered. Margaret's had become his partner in a way that extended beyond professional collaboration, though the transition was gradual and neither of them spoke about it directly. They began spending more time together outside of work, having conversations that ranged beyond immediate investigations to larger questions about justice and reform and what they were trying to accomplish. Over a period of months, this deepened into something more intimate, though it remained expressed primarily through shared work and shared purpose, rather than through romantic sentiment. Neither of them had planned for this or acknowledged it explicitly until one evening. Sitting in the settlement house library after everyone else had left, Margaret simply took his hand and said, "I have been waiting to see if you were going to notice that this matters." He had not known what to say, had simply held her hand and understood that something had shifted, that the partnership that had been defined by shared purpose now also included something personal, something sustained by affection and recognition, rather than simply by commitment to a cause. The apartment they found together was modest, 3 rooms on the second floor of a building in Lawrenceville, not far from where Agnes had lived with her foreman husband years before. The neighborhood had changed since then, had become more established, with families living more permanently, rather than the transient population that had characterized it during his childhood.
It had trees now, actual trees that provided shade in summer and turned colors in autumn. There was a small yard where Margaret planted vegetables and flowers, where they sat on Sunday mornings drinking coffee and reading the newspapers. It was the kind of domestic comfort that he had imagined wanting as a younger man, but had then set aside in pursuit of work that consumed all his attention and energy. Living with Margaret in this space, he discovered that domestic comfort and meaningful work were not actually in conflict, that a person could have both, that having both seemed to deepen rather than diminish the significance of each. Margaret continued her work at the settlement house. He continued at the newspaper. But they did this now with a base of stability and companionship, with someone to come home to at the end of difficult days, with someone who understood what the work meant and why it mattered. They married quietly at City Hall on a Tuesday afternoon in 1901, with Brenner as a witness and Margaret's colleagues from the settlement house attending a small reception afterward. There was no wedding in the church, no family gathering, no ceremony at all beyond the legal formality. Both of them had become accustomed to living outside conventional structures, and a conventional wedding would have felt incongruous with how their lives had been constructed. What mattered was the commitment, not the ritual, though the ritual had its own quiet significance. The early years of the 20th century brought changes to Pittsburgh that were both promising and troubling. The reforms they had fought for were gradually being implemented, though not as comprehensively or as quickly as reformers had hoped. Safety regulations were strengthened, but enforcement remained uneven. Inspection records became more reliable, but corruption persisted in new forms. The city continued to produce steel in ever-increasing quantities, continued to draw workers from around the world, continued to operate on the principle that profit was the highest good and human welfare a secondary consideration. He continued to investigate, but the focus of his work began to shift gradually. The great scandals of corruption and safety negligence had been exposed and partially remedied. What remained were the persistent systemic problems that did not lend themselves to dramatic revelation, but required sustained documentation and analysis. He wrote about wage theft and exploitative labor contracts. He documented the conditions in immigrant neighborhoods where landlords packed families into substandard housing. He investigated child labor and the ways that families were forced to sacrifice their children's futures to immediate economic necessity. This work was less dramatic than the investigations that had made his name, but it was perhaps more important in some ways, because it addressed the permanent structures of exploitation that existed even when the most egregious forms of corruption were being addressed. A worker might be safer in a mill that had been reformed, but he was still paid wages that could not support a family, was still vulnerable to being fired at the employer's whim, was still living in conditions that were degrading and difficult. His work began to attract attention beyond Pittsburgh. Labor publications across the country reprinted his pieces. Progressive academics cited his investigations in scholarly work about industrial conditions. He was invited to speak at universities and reform conferences, to share methodology and findings with others who were engaged in similar work in other cities. Some of these invitations came with offers of employment. suggestions that he might want to relocate to New York or Boston or other cities where the investigative work could reach a larger audience. He considered these offers seriously, understanding that his work might have greater impact if it were published in larger papers with wider circulation. But each time he considered relocating, he found reasons to stay in Pittsburgh. The work here was not finished. The relationships he had built with sources and activists and reform-minded people were valuable and specific to this place. Most importantly, there was something about being rooted in a particular place, about understanding it deeply over years, that seemed essential to the work he was doing. A reporter who moved from city to city would never develop the depth of understanding that came from years of attention and relationship. Margaret supported his decision to stay, though she also understood the cost it carried, the opportunities foregone, the recognition that might have come from working on a larger stage. But she shared his sense that local work had value, that being part of a community and contributing to its transformation was more important than seeking status or influence in larger institutions. They had both learned through their experiences that institutions could be corrupted or compromised, that working for a major newspaper or powerful organization did not guarantee that your work would actually serve justice. By 1905, when he was 38 years old, the landscape of Pittsburgh journalism had changed substantially from what it had been when he first arrived at the Gazette as a nervous young reporter. Reform-minded journalism had become more established and accepted. The success of investigations into corruption and safety violations had demonstrated to even skeptical editors that there was an audience for this kind of reporting, that readers wanted to understand how the systems that affected their lives actually worked. More newspapers were hiring reporters to do investigative work. More editors were willing to publish stories that challenged established interests, though not without limitations and constraints. Renner, recognizing this changing landscape, had expanded the Pittsburgh People's Voice and brought in additional reporters and editors. The newspaper was still small compared to the major dailies, but it had become an institution with real influence, recognized even by mainstream newspapers as producing solid reporting that could not be easily dismissed. Brenner had also become something of a figure in progressive journalism circles, respected as someone who had maintained integrity while building a sustainable publication. He took on a role that was partly reporter and partly mentor, writing his own investigations, but also helping develop stories with younger reporters who were beginning their careers. He taught them the methodology he had developed, the importance of verification and documentation, the discipline of following evidence wherever it led. He also taught them something less tangible but equally important: the understanding that investigative journalism was not simply about exposing scandal, but about understanding systems, about helping readers understand how the world actually worked beneath the surface of official explanations. One of his mentees was a young woman named Rose Kellerman, who had come to the newspaper wanting to write about working conditions for women specifically. Rose was the first woman reporter Brenner had hired, and there had been resistance from some quarters, including some of the male reporters who thought that newspaper work was not appropriate for women. But Rose was stubborn and talented, and she pursued stories about women working in textile mills and as domestic servants, about the particular forms of exploitation and vulnerability that women faced in the workplace and in society more generally. He became her mentor and advocate, helping her develop her skills and defending her from the dismissive attitudes of male colleagues. Rose's work extended the scope of investigative reporting beyond the industrial accidents and corruption that had been the primary focus, bringing attention to forms of exploitation that had previously received little serious journalistic attention. Watching her develop as a reporter reminded him of his own early years, the hunger to tell important stories, the willingness to work hard and take risks in pursuit of truth. Margaret had also expanded her work at the settlement house, which had grown to include more comprehensive services for immigrants and workers. She had become a recognized figure in reform and education circles, invited to speak at conferences and to consult with other settlements about programming and strategy. But she had chosen to remain based in Pittsburgh, to do the work in this place where they had both built lives and relationships. She and her colleagues at the settlement house worked closely with him on investigations, providing access to communities and contexts, helping to understand the human dimensions of the systems he was investigating. In 1908, a new economic crisis gripped the country. Banks failed, businesses collapsed, employment disappeared for months at a time. Pittsburgh was affected severely, with mills shutting down and workers being thrown into desperate poverty. Families that had been barely surviving on low wages suddenly had nothing. The settlement house became overwhelmed with people seeking help. Bread lines stretched around blocks. The city descended into a chaos that made the ordinary injustices of industrial capitalism seem almost quaint by comparison. He wrote extensively about the crisis and its effects, about how the people who had created the conditions that led to the crisis were insulated from its worst consequences, while workers and the poor bore the entire burden. He wrote about the absence of any social safety net, about how workers who had spent their lives working were suddenly treated as failures or as burdens on public charity. He wrote about hunger and eviction and the desperation of parents trying to feed children on nothing. The crisis also shifted something in the broader political landscape. The progressive movement that had been gaining strength over the previous decade accelerated. There was increased demand for regulation of business, for protection of workers, for the establishment of public programs to address poverty and unemployment. The investigations that he and others like him had conducted over the previous years had built the intellectual foundation for understanding that these problems were systemic rather than individual, that addressing them required structural change rather than simply punishing corrupt individuals. When the economy gradually began to recover, beginning in 1909, the political climate had shifted permanently. Younger politicians began to speak about regulation and reform as normal aspects of government, rather than as radical ideas. Journalists who had been marginal figures in the previous decade were now being consulted by government officials, seeking to understand conditions and problems that needed to be addressed. The kind of investigative journalism that had required him to sacrifice his career at the Gazette was becoming more mainstream and more acceptable. By 1910, he had become an elder statesman of investigative journalism in Pittsburgh, someone whose work was respected and whose counsel was sought by younger reporters and by reform organizations. He continued to pursue investigations, but he also spent increasing amounts of time teaching, mentoring, and working with organizations focused on labor and social reform. He had moved from being someone on the margins of journalism, challenging the established order, to being someone whose work was recognized as important and valuable by mainstream institutions, though he remained somewhat outside mainstream journalism itself. This shift brought mixed feelings. There was satisfaction in being recognized, in having his work validated by people in positions of authority. But there was also a loss, a sense that the edge of his work had been dulled by acceptance, that he was no longer as much of an outsider challenging the system as he was an insider participating in that system's gradual reformation. He discussed these feelings with Margaret, who suggested that this was perhaps the natural evolution of a career devoted to change, that at some point the rebel had to either step aside for a new generation or find a way to continue the work from a different position. He chose the latter path, understanding that he still had work to do, that being recognized did not mean the fundamental problems had been solved. The reforms that had been implemented were real and meaningful, but they were also insufficient. Workers were still exploited. The system still prioritized profit over human welfare. Corruption still persisted in new forms and new places. What had changed was not the reality of injustice, but the visibility of it, the willingness of people to acknowledge it and to demand change. As he approached 40, the decade since the Monongahela fire investigation felt both infinitely distant and immediate. He had lived multiple lifetimes in those years, had moved from being a struggling reporter searching for truth to being someone recognized as a voice for truth and justice. But the underlying structures of his life remained similar. He was still a person who worked with words and ideas, who tried to understand systems and to communicate that understanding to others, who believed that truth mattered and that journalism had a responsibility to serve justice. Margaret had become his anchor in ways he could not quite articulate. Their marriage was not romantic in the way that popular fiction depicted romance. It was built on shared purpose and mutual respect, and the daily work of living together and supporting each other through difficulty. But it was profound in ways that surprised him with its depth. Having someone who understood what his work meant, who supported it without needing to fully participate in it, who provided the stability and care that made the work possible, had become essential. One evening, sitting in their small yard as autumn turned to winter, Margaret asked him what he would do if he could do anything at all, if he were freed from the constraints of needing to work for money or needing to maintain any professional reputation. He considered the question seriously, not rushing to an answer. After a long pause, he told her that he would probably do exactly what he was already doing, investigating and writing about injustice, trying to help people understand how systems worked, believing that truth was worth pursuing even when it was difficult and costly. "Then you have found the right life," Margaret said simply. "Not the life you planned, but the life that is right for who you are." He understood that she was right, that through accident and choice and circumstance, he had ended up doing work that gave his life meaning and purpose. He thought about his father, who had died in the mills for no great cause, whose death had been reduced to an unfortunate accident that required no explanation or responsibility. He thought about his mother, who had struggled her entire life simply to survive, who had never had the luxury of doing work that gave her satisfaction or purpose. He thought about the thousands of workers who had been killed or injured in the mills and factories, whose deaths had been documented in investigation and had perhaps, through investigation and journalism, been given some meaning beyond their immediate tragedy. The work would continue. There would be new investigations, new stories to pursue, new systems of injustice to expose. The reformers would make gains and then have to fight for them again as new forms of exploitation emerged. The struggle between justice and profit would continue indefinitely, would probably never be finally resolved. But in the working of that struggle, in the pursuit of truth and the attempt to communicate it to others, there was something worth doing, something that gave life meaning even in the face of persistent injustice. As the year 1910 turned toward 1911, he looked at the city around him with eyes that had learned to see both its terrible injustices and its human potential. Pittsburgh was still grinding mills, still producing steel for a rapidly industrializing world, still drawing workers from everywhere, seeking better lives. It was still a place of exploitation and inequality, of wealth accumulating in the hands of the few, while the many struggled. But it was also a place where people were beginning to understand their own power, where workers were organizing, where reformers were pushing for change, where journalism was beginning to fulfill its potential to reveal truth and to serve justice. The fire at the Monongahela Steelworks seemed now like a hinge point, a moment when everything had pivoted and changed direction. 37 men had died that day, and their deaths had been the beginning of understanding something larger about the systems that governed the city and the country. They had not died for nothing, though he knew that the comfort of that knowledge could not have been much to their widows and children. But their deaths had set in motion investigations and revelations and reforms that would eventually improve conditions for thousands of other workers, that would change how the city understood its relationship to the people who made its wealth. He continued his work into the autumn, investigating new stories, mentoring younger reporters, working with Margaret on settlement house projects that served the city's most vulnerable residents. He lived modestly, having never accumulated wealth despite the success of his work. His apartment and his clothing and his habits remained those of a working person, not because he was unable to have more, but because more had never seemed necessary or desirable. What mattered was the work and the relationships and the knowledge that his life had been devoted to something that extended beyond himself. The future remained uncertain. He could not predict where investigations would lead, or what reforms would be possible, or how long he would be able to continue the work that had become the center of his life. But looking back over the years since he had left the print shop as a young man seeking something he could not name, he could see that he had found it in the difficult, costly, essential work of pursuing truth and bearing witness to injustice, and believing that truth mattered.